AI has just translated ancient Sumerian tablets, and the results are terrifying. Buried in those clay lines was a version of human history that tears apart everything we've been taught.
These clay tablets are 5,000 years old and more, and they tell of the arrival of the Anunnaki, the pantheon of gods. The chief was Anu. This is the sky god who came along and created everything.
In 1853, in the dust-choked ruins of Kuyunjik near ancient Nineveh, a team sorting through blackened debris from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal pulled out a clay fragment that nobody knew how to explain. It was small, warped by fire, burned so hard it had become almost stone. At first glance, it looked like one more damaged piece from a shattered Mesopotamian archive. But pressed into its surface were lines of cuneiform so strange, so deliberate, that even the first catalogers reportedly set it aside rather than classify it. One line appeared to name Enki. Another described the first form of the worker before correction. And then came the phrase that would haunt everyone who touched the text afterward. What was shaped was not yet as now. It should not exist. Libraries burn, empires fall, tablets crack. But this one survived fire, burial, transport, catalog neglect, and more than a century of silence. And the deeper researchers looked, the stranger it became. Because this was not a hymn, not a king list, not a prayer for grain or victory. The language was dry, ordered, procedural. This was not mythology. This was not metaphor. This was a technical description. And if you're the kind of person who knows history is full of locked doors nobody wants opened, subscribe now. Because this is the kind of discovery that starts in a forgotten archive and ends by forcing a terrifying question. What if the ancients were not describing the creation of humanity, but its modification? For decades, the fragment reportedly sat in storage, grouped with other fire-damaged tablets from Assyrian contexts. Misfilled because the signs were difficult and the surface was scarred. That was the safe explanation. Damaged text, ritual language, another broken relic from a dead world. But then, in the early 20th century, when better copies were made from squeezes and hand tracings, several repeating terms began to stand out. The signs associated with form, measure, blood, and bond appeared too close together too often in patterns that made no sense as poetry. It made no sense, unless the writer was describing process. That is what makes ancient Mesopotamia so dangerous to dismiss. Modern history tells us Sumer and Akkad were advanced for their time, but still limited. No telescopes, no satellites, no gene labs, no modern instruments. They had reed styluses, clay tablets, temple mathematics, and naked eye astronomy. They built cities when much of the world was still tribal. They mapped the heavens, divided circles into degrees, counted in 60s, tracked Venus, predicted seasonal cycles, engineered canals, raised ziggurats, and kept records with a precision that still unsettles historians. They were not primitive, but they were still supposed to be bounded by their age. But the tablets say otherwise. Again and again, Mesopotamian texts speak in a voice that feels older than story. They list stars, radios, rains, flood layers, sacred numbers, cycles of 12, 60, 600, 3600. They treat the sky as a timed mechanism. They describe divine beings not only as objects of worship, but as administrators, planners, and measurers. The official explanation has always been that this was symbolic cosmology, ritual language, priestly imagination dressed in celestial metaphor. The problem is that symbols do not usually arrive wrapped in mathematics. By the time scholars began comparing cuneiform archives across Nineveh, Nippur, Sippar, the older Sumerian tradition, they had already realized something unsettling. These civilizations were not merely telling stories about gods, they were preserving systems, astronomical systems, agricultural systems, kingship systems, and perhaps, according to the Burned Tablet, biological systems too. Here's where it gets strange. The fragment that later became known in whispered circles as the Burned Tablet of Enki was said to contain part of a larger composition copied by Assyrian scribes from an even older Sumerian source. That matters, because if the copy was first millennium BCE, the original tradition could have been far older. The text reportedly referred to Enki not simply as a god of wisdom and subterranean waters, but as a designer, a corrector, a being who saw the first workers and found them unfinished. One reconstructed line suggested that the early form of humanity could endure longer spans, perceive more cycles, and remain closer to the bright ordinances before alteration. Another line described a reduction, a limiting, a narrowing of years. At first, researchers assumed it was symbolic. That was the safe interpretation. God's limiting human lifespan is familiar territory. Flood stories already carry that theme. But then the wording became harder to ignore. The text did not merely say humans were made weak. It described measured adjustment, radios, portions, binding one essence to another, fixing the form so the worker would remain stable inside the world of clay. Worker, not child, not worshiper, worker, and that single word changed the tone of everything, because Mesopotamian creation traditions already carried disturbing echoes. In Atrahasis, humankind is created to relieve the lesser gods of labor. In other texts, blood and clay are mixed. In temple literature, humans exist in relation to service, burden, maintenance, order. Most scholars read this as theological metaphor, reflecting labor systems and divine kingship. Fair enough. But if the burned tablet is read literally, the implication becomes difficult to dismiss. Humanity was not simply made. Humanity was revised for function. When later translators revisited the fragment, one of the most controversial observations involved the repeated use of signs that seemed to distinguish between an earlier model and a corrected one. Not different tribes, not generations, forms. The official explanation was scribal repetition, but the structure looked intentional, like versioning, like a record of edits, and this is where the story begins to move from strange to disturbing. In 1968, according to accounts circulated among independent researchers, a German Assyriologist working from older museum photographs compared the fragment with known Enki creation texts and noticed that the sequence of terms near the broken center did not fit ordinary mythic composition. He expected religious poetry. What he found instead was a pattern: first form, deficiency, mixture, correction, fixed lifespan, restricted knowledge. He reportedly argued that the tablet read less like worship and more like a workshop memorandum copied into sacred language. His paper was never widely circulated. The conclusion was branded sensational. The artifact was not disproven. It was simply ignored. That is how uncomfortable discoveries disappear. They are not always burned. They are not always publicly refuted. They are labeled symbolic, placed in storage, and forgotten. Mainstream scholars, of course, had reasons for caution. Ancient texts are fragmentary. Translation is difficult. A single broken sign can alter meaning. Context matters. And yet calling everything metaphor only works until the same pattern appears across multiple texts. The safe explanation was mythology. But mythology does not usually preserve procedural vocabulary with mathematical framing. Dismissing it as primitive religion becomes harder when the numbers match systems the civilization tracked with astonishing precision. Then modern science added fuel to the fire, not because laboratories confirmed Enki, they did not, but because human biology itself began to look stranger. The deeper science looked into it. They had no genetic labs, no microscopes, no DNA sequencing. Yet the Burned Tablet describes humanity not as complete from the beginning, but as altered, revised, limited. Modern genetics, for its part, shows a species marked by abrupt cognitive leaps, unusual regulatory changes, and inherited traces of interbreeding with populations we barely understand. Researchers now speak of ghost lineages, accelerated regions of the genome, and bottlenecks that reshaped what our species became. Science explains these through evolution, adaptation, and deep time. But the language is still unsettlingly close to the tablet's logic. There was an earlier form, and then something changed. The numbers make it worse. Mesopotamian scholars tracked sacred cycles with a seriousness that still feels uncanny. They worked in base 60. They divided circles in ways the modern world still uses. They attached significance to long celestial returns and great periods. Some later interpreters argued that one damaged section of the Burned Tablet linked humanity's correction to the timing of a larger heavenly cycle, period associated with return, upheaval, and judgment. Mainstream history has no clean answer for why so many ancient cultures were obsessed with recurrent sky cycles and world renewals. The Sumerians had them, Egypt had them, Mesoamerica had them, India had them. Even later apocalyptic traditions inherited the same fear. History is not merely moving forward, it is circling towards something. But then something changed in our own era. Astronomy began revealing a universe far less stable and simple than textbooks once promised. Planetary wobble, ice core catastrophe records, sudden climate reversals, comet impact evidence, solar cycles influencing Earth more than older models allowed. The ancients watched the sky because to them, the sky was not background. It was command. And if they were right about the sky, what else were they right about? The mystery gets even bigger when you step outside Mesopotamia. In Egypt, Khnum fashions humans on a potter's wheel, shaping bodies with deliberate craft. In the Hebrew tradition, Long lifespans shrink after divine intervention and catastrophe. In the Greek world, Prometheus and the gods treat mankind as something assembled, taught, restricted. In the Popol Vuh of Mesoamerica, multiple versions of humanity are made and discarded before the final form is accepted. In some Gnostic traditions, human consciousness is trapped, limited, veiled. In the Dogon stories of Mali, beings from the sky bring ordered knowledge connected to the stars. In the Hopi traditions, previous worlds end and a surviving remnant enters another cycle. Different continents, different languages, different gods, same structure. An older form, a correction, a limitation, a flood or reset, a memory of beings from above, a warning tied to celestial return. Calling one story coincidence is easy. Calling the global pattern coincidence becomes harder. And then there is Enki himself. Not the thunder god, not the warrior king of heaven. Enki is the intelligence behind the curtain, the measurer, the cunning one, the keeper of the me, the ordered principles of civilization. In later readings, he is the one who intervenes, who saves knowledge, who preserves life through catastrophe. But on the burned tablet, if the interpretation is correct, he is also the one who changed the human template. Why? To stabilize us? To control us? To help us survive here? Or to make us fit a world that was never originally ours? That is the dark implication buried beneath all the ancient language. Humanity's current form may not be our original condition. Our shortened lifespan, our dimmed perception, our fractured memory, our endless labor, our distance from whatever the ancients called the bright ordinances, these may not be natural losses. They may be engineered limits, not punishment, design. And if that is true, then everything changes. It would mean the oldest creation stories on Earth are not really about beginnings. They are about revision, about a species adjusted to serve, survive, and forget. It would mean the ancient gods were remembered not because they threw lightning, but because they altered the terms of human existence itself. It would mean the first civilizations were not simply inventing religion. They were guarding memory in ritual form because direct language was too dangerous, too fragile, too easy to erase. This is also why institutions recoil from subjects like this. Not necessarily because there is a coordinated conspiracy in a dark room somewhere, but because whole careers are built on stable timelines. Museums need labels. Universities need defensible interpretations. Peer review rewards caution. Grants do not flow towards scholars who argue that myth may preserve technical memory. So what happens to anomalous evidence? It is not destroyed, it is domesticated, symbolic, ceremonial, mythic. End of discussion. The easiest way to bury a discovery is to make serious people afraid to discuss it seriously. And if a burned tablet in a basement archive hinted that humanity once existed in another form before being altered by a figure remembered as Enki, what institution would rush to place that on a museum wall? None. It would remain where so many uncomfortable objects remain. In drawers, in photographs, in catalogs few people read. Waiting for one stubborn translator, one engineer with a strange hobby, one astronomer willing to compare the old numbers with the new sky. One independent researcher willing to ask the forbidden question. What if the ancients were describing history, not belief? So what does this mean for us? Maybe nothing. Maybe a damaged tablet and a chain of daring interpretations. But that answer gets weaker the more patterns appear. The more ancient texts speak of cycles. The more they describe humanity as made, adjusted, bounded. The more modern science reveals how abrupt and unusual parts of our story still look. The more global traditions remember prior worlds, sky beings, lost knowledge, and a break in memory. Because that may be the true horror at the center of this story. Not that gods came down. Not that a tablet survived a fire. Not even that ancient people wrote things they should not have known. The real horror is that they may have known exactly what we are, and exactly what happened to us, and they tried to preserve it in clay because they understood something we have forgotten. That human history is not a straight line from primitive caves to modern cities. It is a damaged archive, a broken memory, a sequence of corrections. And somewhere inside it, according to the burned tablet of Enki, there was once another version of us. One closer to the sky, one less constrained, one before the alteration. So ask yourself this: if the text was not myth, then what exactly was Enki correcting? If humanity was revised, what was removed? Longer life? Deeper perception? A clearer bond with whatever ancient people believed moved among the stars? And if the tablet tied that revision to a cycle, then are we nearing another turning now? Maybe that is why the ancients watched the heavens with such obsession. Not out of superstition, out of memory, out of fear, out of expectation. Maybe the stars were never just stars to them. Maybe they were a clock, And maybe the real question is not whether the ones who changed us ever came here. Maybe the real question is whether they ever truly left. If this made you question everything you were taught about the origin of humanity, subscribe now, because in the next video, we're going into the one Mesopotamian seal some researchers say is decorative, but others believe is a coded map of a world that should not be in our history at all. And before you go, tell me what you think in the comments. Myth, mistranslation, or a warning from the oldest memory on Earth? Because if the ancient records are right, then the story of humanity did not begin with us. And it may not end with us either.